comfort. In a big car, you expect it. But now you can find it in a new kind of small American car. Volare.
Back in 1976, after the end of a successful 16-year run of their A-body compacts, the Valiant and Dart, Chrysler tried to move their compact offerings upscale with the Plymouth Volare and Dodge Aspen.
Volare. Plymouth Volare.
Although it introduced a new isolating suspension design to give the smaller cars a big ride,
Everyone seems to agree this Aspen wagon is unbelievable.
Chrysler pushed their development schedule too fast, resulting in cars that went on sale at least 6 months too early. The reputation of both cars was quickly tarnished with what would be, at the time, the most recalls any model had ever received, leading to only a 5-year model run. This is the story of Chrysler's F-body twins, the Plymouth Volare and Dodge Aspen. This is my old car.
Hurry, you know this is my favorite day of the week.
I know both.
So you may have noticed that in my video's title, I included an accent over the last E in Volare, even though that accent should make it pronounced as Volare. This word, which is Italian for to fly, doesn't have the accent when written in Italian. Instead, the accent over the E mimics Chrysler's advertising of the time. Maybe they thought that with no accent, or the accent over the A, we stupid Americans would pronounce it as Volare. Maybe not, as having the accent was most likely Chrysler's way to make the car seem more sophisticated than it was. It also helped them create the tagline that Volare was a small car with the accent on value, or on comfort, or on whatever word fit the need for the ad. The Volare Aspen twins were the planned replacements for the Plymouth Valiant and Dodge Dart, which first arrived in 1960.
There's never been a Dart for you to see.
And by 1976, were riding on the same A-body platform that was now 16 years old. Both the Valiant and Dart were classified as compact cars when they were new. However, by the mid-70s, with the same basic dimensions, they were now considered intermediate, or mid-size, thanks to the arrival of much smaller Japanese imports. Although Chrysler did offer compact models in the form of captive imports, like the Colt from Mitsubishi, they still had plenty of large, make that very large cars still on dealer lots, like the New Yorker, which had been redesigned to be even bigger at the worst possible time, just before the oil embargo hit.
A Chrysler with an altogether new appearance. A Chrysler with an abundance of comfort.
With the A-body design considered ancient when defined in car years, Chrysler was confident that its F-body replacement would be a big leap in modern design, and consequently would make it a big success as well. The arrival of the Volare and Aspen couldn't come soon enough, as Chrysler ended 1975 with a loss of $260 million. That's well over $1 billion in today's money.
Can a car be so delightful when it's small?
The F-body was offered a coupe, sedan, and wagon, and for their time looked quite stylish, especially considering the outgoing Valiant and Dart were lacking in that department. The coupe, which was 4 inches shorter in wheelbase than the sedan and wagon, had a rear-end design that I think looked similar to the closest competition at Ford, the Maverick. Not yet sporting the extremely square look that would later define the late 70s and early 80s, the Volare and Aspen had just enough curves to look a bit more aerodynamic. Although the trends were moving towards less curvy lines, the F-body didn't entirely give up those 70s curves. The wagon option provided Chrysler with a leg up on Ford and GM, who didn't yet offer a wagon in the smaller size, although they would catch up a couple years later. As far as differences between the Volare and Aspen, it was Chrysler's mantra back then to not make any effort to differentiate the two brands, although Plymouth would later become the value leader among the Chrysler divisions, and would have, at the very least, a different grille to distinguish itself. The Volare and Aspen only differed in badging on the outside, and were literally identical on the inside. Back then, the number of Dodge dealerships nearly equaled the Chrysler Plymouth dealerships, so an Aspen was merely a Volare that you bought from a Dodge dealer. Or you could say a Volare was an Aspen that you bought at a Chrysler Plymouth dealer. It simply didn't matter from a build standpoint. Chrysler did this later with the Dodge Diplomat and Plymouth Grand Fury, and as far as into the 90s with the Dodge and Plymouth Neon. That last one was also marketed as a Chrysler in some markets. All the same car. Yet they had essentially duplicate marketing costs, which surprised me that Plymouth didn't die off during Chrysler's government bailout. Upon their release for the 1976 model year, some automotive magazines of the time were quite impressed with the new F-body models. Motor Trend magazine named the Volare and Aspen as their car of the year for 1976, a fact that they are far from proud to admit today, but consider the context of the time. The Valiant and Dart they replaced had become old and tired, and the competition for best car wasn't all that great in 1976. as the Chevy Chevette and AMC Pacer were also finalists for that top spot. But when compared to the land yachts Chrysler still had on the market, the Volare and Aspen looked like a giant step in the right direction. What Motor Trend and other auto publications may not have realized at the time was that both cars were pushed to the market about 6 months early, before sufficient pre-production testing had been completed.
You all went through the stop sign over there, okay? And that's a moving violation. And my brother and I, we have a lot of parking tickets, eh? What?
Had the proper testing been done, the Volare and Aspen probably would have debuted as 1977 models, not 76. And with so much money already spent on their development, Chrysler likely couldn't afford the additional millions of dollars needed for proper testing.
Unbelievable.
Another cost-cutting measure was to continue using the same engines that were in the Valiant and Dart, a choice of a 3.7-liter Slant 6, a 5.2-liter V8, or 5.9-liter V8. There were also performance-themed trims for the coupe on both cars, called the Volare Roadrunner and Aspen RT. Although thanks to performance zapping emission requirements, neither trim, especially the Roadrunner, lived up to their name. Thanks to some overconfidence within Chrysler management, the F-body models were released too early, as they believed the car would be a hit with buyers, despite protests and warnings from those responsible for pre-production testing. But the initial public response seemed to justify the decision to release the cars early, as more than 500,000 Volares and Aspens sold for the 1976 model year. This is even more impressive when you consider that the Valiant and Dart had not yet been discontinued, as Chrysler still sold them for one overlapping model year. For 1977, the Volare and Aspen sales numbers jumped to nearly 700,000, which was more than half of the total sales the Dodge and Plymouth divisions had for that year. But before the 1977 model year finished, the bugs started to appear. For just the 1976 model year alone, there were 8 serious recalls. Most of them were to prevent potential injury or death, such as risk of brake failure, suspension detaching from the subframe, detaching steering wheel columns, hood latch failures, and seat belts unlatching. Then there were missing inner linings on the front fenders, which also were not galvanized, done on purpose to save money. The premature rusting required new fenders to be made for over 1 million cars. However, it was chronic stalling and poor drivability that got most of the bad press, as well as leaky trunks, broken motor mounts, and many electrical problems. In the end, Chrysler had to recall over 1.3 million cars. At the time, that was an industry record. The GM would beat that record just a few years later with their X-Body lineup that starred the Chevy Citation.
Hi, guys.
The millions of dollars that Chrysler saved by moving up their release schedule was a fraction of the billions they ultimately spent in recalls. Despite this, Chrysler still managed to offer a facelift on the 1978 models, but the option packaging was simplified. In effect, every car was a base model, and then other upgrades could be added. They also offered what was called a kit car, making the car on the outside look like it would be in NASCAR, but inside it was still the same as any other, complete with a very non-racing oriented automatic transmission. A Super Coupe trim was also available that improved the suspension and offered the largest 5.9-liter V8, which still could only muster 170 horsepower, and couldn't even be sold in California due to its poor mileage rating of 15 miles per gallon. Sales for 1978 had dropped to below what they had sold for 1976, which was thanks not just to the recalls, but also competition from downsized models from both GM and Ford, the latter's most notable being the Fairmont.
Volare and Fairmont.
They both seem like good cars.
Although the Fairmont had a much more slab-sided square design as compared to the Volare and Aspen, it didn't have all the recall trouble and proved to be an early success. Meanwhile, that same year, Chrysler hired Lee Iacocca, who was recently let go from Ford. His first order of business was to ask the U.S. federal government for a bailout loan, followed by starting the development of the Volare and Aspen replacements, the Dodge Aries and Plymouth Reliant, best known as the K-Cars. Iacocca wrote in his autobiography that he considered the F-body to be one of Chrysler's biggest missteps, although that wasn't too hard for him to admit since he wasn't there at the time. And although he started the K-Car development, ensuring the F-body's demise, he insisted on a redesign for the final model year of 1980. But he managed to do this relatively cheaply by sharing the front fenders and hood with the Dodge Diplomat. Speaking of the Diplomat, the work on the F-body didn't completely go to waste, as it would be reworked to become the M-body, the basis of the second-generation Diplomat, and its twin, the Plymouth Grand Fury. Both of these models would cement themselves in popular culture as one of the most popular cop cars we would see on TV and movies in the 80s.
Just tell me where the seatbelt is at!
The final 1980 model year saw around 167,000 sales combined of the Volare and Aspen models, although most of those sales were fleet or police use, and was a significant drop compared to its peak in 1977. In the end, despite the two models remaining virtually identical, the Volare managed to outsell its Dodge Aspen twin by a considerable margin. with nearly 3/4 of the combined sales going to the Volare. Maybe because the name Volare made the Plymouth sound like a European car, unlike the Aspen, which was named after the ski resort town in Colorado. I suspect most consumers of the time were indifferent to the Aspen name, so much so that the poor quality reputation didn't stick to that name like it did with the Volare. I think proof of that is that Chrysler saw no issue with reusing the Aspen name for a Dodge Durango rebadge in 2007. Admittedly, the Chrysler Aspen SUV was a sales flop, but probably not because of the name. By 2007, most Chrysler dealers sold Dodge vehicles as well, and the Chrysler name simply didn't hold enough prestige to justify paying more for the Aspen, when a comparably equipped and cheaper Durango sat in the same showroom. With no help from those cringy commercials,
Volare, Plymouth Volare.
The Volare has gone down in automotive history as one of Chrysler's biggest failures, despite over 1.8 million Volares and Aspens being built over its 5-year run. Maybe this would be a good entry for a future top 10 list of cars that still sold well despite being considered failures today. If you still own one today, complete with all of its recall fixes, be sure to take it to your local car show so you can hear everybody sing
Volare. Oh.
Guess what?
Thanks for watching.
You just finished reading the Sherlock Holmes book I gave you and have decided to become a master of disguise, right?
If you like this video, click the like button and subscribe to my channel. If you once owned a car from the 70s to mid-2000s that you rarely see today and would like it featured in a future episode, leave a reply in the comments or contact me at the email shown here. See you next time.